Good evening to those of us who are in the room and to those of us who are in different rooms. I'd like to commence by acknowledging that those of us who are here are on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to pay our respects to elders past and present, and to invite anyone who is in other country to do the same. Thank you very much, those of you who are here in all different places, for joining us for what is a very special event for the Sydney Environment Institute, the farewell lecture for our postdoctoral fellow, Christine Winter, who is going to be speaking on the illusion of boundaries and the gift of multi-species justice. This event is being presented by the Sydney Environment Institute, with which I'm sure everybody is familiar, but the Sydney Environment Institute is one of the university's multidisciplinary initiatives, and our aspiration is to make a difference to the environmental crises in which we all find ourselves, but to do so by bringing together scholars from across the university and bringing scholars together with people outside the university and with the earth. So I'm Dani Celermajer, I'm the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute, and it is my great honour and pleasure to be facilitating this conversation tonight. And I'm going to commence by introducing Christine, who is known, I am sure, to everybody. So Christine is finishing her postdoctoral fellowship with the Sydney Environment Institute. She's also a member of the Department of Government and International Relations, both communities sadly farewelling her at this time. Her research focuses on intergenerational, environmental and Indigenous justice, and she brings a decolonising lens to all of her work. Christine has brought her Celtic, Anglo, Maori heritage to think about what does it mean to truly decolonise environmental political theory and political theory more generally, and to really rigorously investigate the assumptions that continue to run through the way in which we do political theory. I wanted to say more personally that during her time with the Sydney Environment Institute, and even before, when she was doing her PhD under the supervision of Professor David Schlossberg, the director of the Institute, and Professor Alex Lefebvre, Christine really became known to all of us, has had a huge influence on her colleagues proximate and her colleagues more remote, and scholars really all over the world, and also very much her students in the fields of environmental political theory and Indigenous political theory. And for me to distinguish what's distinct about Christine's scholarship, we need to think both about the what of her scholarship, but also the how of her scholarship. And the what is a careful, complex and systematic attention to foundational concepts of political theory, so freedom, justice, the subject, reason, spirit, earth, and so on. But the how, which we talk about less often, is really this simultaneous razor-sharp intellect, but also with a tremendous amount of respect for her subject, capaciously understood, and for her colleagues. So Christine's commitment to justice, capaciously understood, is absolutely unfailing. And so too is her commitment to creating communities that are open, curious, and courageous. And that means, and this is really an outstanding quality of Christine's collegiality, is a type of capacity to be experimental and to get things wrong. And there is no one at the Sydney Environment Institute who I think has made such a singular contribution in creating a community in which we can be experimental and brave with our thinking, and I really do want to, on behalf of all of us, deeply acknowledge Christine for that. She's speaking tonight about the gift of multi-species justice, but Christine has been a gift to us, and you will be sorely missed because you are irreplaceable. Thank you.
Golly, I'm floored. So, tēnā koutou. Ko tamatia ariki nui te tangata. Ko rua whāro te tohanga. Ko takitimu te woka. Ko whakapunaki te monga. Ko wairoa te awa. Ko Ngāti Kahanunu ki wairoa te iwi. Ko Ngāti Hinamihi te hapu. No whanau mai o I raro ki te koruwai o Taranaki Monga. Ko Gadigal te iwi o te wahi o noho neo. Ko Brent taku hoa rangatira. Ko Nick ro, ko Alex ko ako rather tamariki. Ko Christine toku ingoa. Nō reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight, virtually and really. I've just told you who I am, who my ancestors were, where I came from, who I relate to, and where I have and do live. And that statement was a pepeha, and it'll inform some of the weave of tonight's presentation. So my focus is really on the power of traditions such as that to draw attention back to human place in the world, to a place that is more than simply the human realm, or what we might call culture or cultural. By including our natural reference, our ancestral landscape, in formal speech and in our statements of identity, we're reminded how we are situated in the world and to whom we relate, and the sorts of relationships we have and to which we owe responsibilities. They remind us, we are one of many species, one of multiple webs of being that spread across the planet. They remind us too, we are one with many other things and with many other beings, always a mountainous landform and a body of water, a river, a lake, or the seas, with whom, or without whom rather, we are not. So they remind us of our ancestors, and they keep the ancestors close. They remind us that we have responsibilities to our ancestors, genetic and otherwise, our community and to future generations. They remind us of this every time we have a gathering. I'm just taking off these because I'm sure they're irritating. So, the natural realm is included in a formal statement of belonging, as is the spiritual realm. And this happens, as I say, whenever there is a gathering. In Te Ao Māori, in the Māori world, everything is steeped in what we are calling here in the Academy, multi-species justice. So pepeha make humans mindful of their multi-species entanglements, responsibilities, and vulnerability. So these are the ideas that I'm going to explore tonight. Connection and responsibility of flows and tangles of webs that connect through a shared reverence for creation. And most of all, I'll be talking about the potential of the concept of multi-species justice to break through the cascade of artificial boundaries that allow, for instance, a Minister for the Environment to sign off on a fossil fuel development, knowing full well that in doing so, they're committing the world, not just the nation, but the whole world, to catastrophic consequences. Sorry, I'll just put my teeth in. What I'm suggesting here is that it's not just the obvious targets, like capitalism and political capture and imperialism and so on, that support this behaviour, but that it's that its foundations are at a far more fundamental level, at the epistemic and ontological levels. Don't laugh at me, David. And this is where I understand the gift of multi-species justice to lie. In breaking down a whole bunch of boundaries, multi-species justice reframes the sorts of epistemic frameworks that support the Minister of the Environment's ability to isolate economic imperatives from environmental outcomes, for instance. So simultaneously, it breaks ontological boundaries. Those that, again, for instance, allow the same minister to view the environment, a landform, the soil, plant life, insects, animals, birds, fish, and the elements, to consider all of these as distinctly separate from human forces, to keep artificial and destructive boundaries between nature and culture. And this is the gift of multi-species justice. So this is a farewell presentation. So it's an opportunity for me to give thanks in a public forum to a few amazing people. It's not everybody, and there are some of you who are not going to be on this list, so I'm sorry, but I can only say thank you to a few. I've had the unbelievably good fortune to be part of the SEI Multispecies Justice Collective, which is nestled into the wider SEI family and the University of Sydney. The team at SEI, the team that have made tonight happen, and who will make tonight keep on happening with follow-up videos and writing and whatever other magic they've got in store. To Eloise Fetterplace, to Evie Wright, and to Emma Holland, thank you. Thank you for your tireless good work in the background. It's an absolute delight to work with you. So not only have I been part of SEI, but also a department, and I'm in the nick of time to be able to still call it a department, the Department of Government and International Relations. So I thank you, all the people, all the wonderful friends and colleagues I have in the department for their support, for laughter, for intellectual stimulation, and for generating a community focused not only on really rigorous research, but also a really clear commitment to student learning and student welfare. It was just sheer, unadulterated good luck that led me to David Schlossberg. And it's nearly a decade ago. He guided me through my PhD and then to a whole bunch of environmental justice communities. And of course, he created with others SEI, and the opportunity that SEI offers for real interdisciplinary engagement and collaborations that are both stimulating and generative. And they've really made a lasting impact on me. So David, thank you for everything. And I had about 3 more paragraphs written, but time means I cannot say them. So David, thank you. And then through some means that are completely and utterly a mystery to me, I came within Danny Celermajer's generous orbit. And that again is just the most extraordinary good fortune. Without Danny, I may not have taken this quite deliberate multi-species turn. Not because it wasn't already tucked into my work, but because I wouldn't have called it that. Instead, I would have remained embedded within the environmental justice community and somewhat apart, because the ideas that fit neatly into multi-species justice are still largely outside the mainstream. So thank you, Danny. Thank you for that. It's been a wondrous ride. Without David and Danny, there would have been no postdoc for me to apply for and no need for this farewell speech. So again, publicly, I thank you, David and Danny, for unparalleled generosity and a soaring intellectual journey, and really most importantly for your friendship. Thank you. Finally, I'll touch on 3 other collaborators, members of the Multispecies Justice Collective, whose thinking and generosity have led depth to my own thought. So Dinesh Wadewell, Blanche Verley, and Sophie Chow. Thank you all too. It's been a joy working with you all, and I look forward to many years of future collaborations, and I am really sorry to be leaving this cub of kindness, rigour, intellectual adventure and fun. And if I keep on going, I'm going to cry. So finally, to my wonderful partner, Brent, thank you. Brent has supported what really has been a midlife flight of fancy, and he's also supporting the new pivot in our life that's allowing me to leap from here to Otago University, and I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you, Brent. Now let's move away from the emotional. Let's move to the project of multispecies justice, an idea that responds to the abuse and the degradation of nature, and that understands these as products of specific attitudes and values about what it is to be human and what it is to be human in the world and on the planet. Multispecies justice is a very interdisciplinary pursuit, and in many ways it is breaking through innumerable academic boundaries and through the formations that imagined and brought into being the imperial and the colonial projects. Multispecies justice is a challenge to the philosophies, the politics, and the policies that the idea of boundaries enable, that support and justify the sorts of human behaviour that generate multiple harms: exploitation, extraction, environmental degradation, climate change, and the sixth mass extinction. When I say it like that, it sounds like I'm talking about harms to the natural realm. But if I were to stop for a moment and give you time to think otherwise, that list, exploitation, extraction, environmental degradation, climate change, and the sixth mass extinction, draw no such boundaries. We can think everything on the list imposes harm on each realm, on the human realm, on the natural realm, and on the spiritual realm. We can think of it perhaps in relation to politics, to policies like offshore detention, that Australia is now exported to the UK. Offshore detention, a means of enforcing and furthermore creating new borders. What the government doesn't discuss, openly anyway, is that offshore detention is a barbaric response to planetary problems forced upon human, non-human, and the spiritual realm by globalisation. I suggest that the perpetrators of any of the harms that I've listed can only justify that harm through partition, through the act of raising boundary artifices, physical and abstract, real, intellectual and emotional. So what has any of that got to do with multispecies justice? As part of the politics of offshore detention the politics of offshore detention can be maintained, can be justified by othering and animalising migrants. Like wild animals and wild weather, they pose a threat. By casting refugees as something in deficit, as not fully human and deserving, we can cage them indefinitely. The logics behind offshore detention are rooted in, I suggest, the same logics that are catapulting the world into the Anthropocene, into a new geological epoch, into conditions of radical meteorological upheaval. These are the logics of nature versus culture, of domination over and abuse of anything that isn't fully human, of artificial boundaries between human and element, human and landform, human and animal, human and plant, between human and human. I say artificial boundaries, but surely these boundaries are real. So let me bring you back to the challenge on the promotional material for this talk. Where does the you end and the air begin? Where does the air end and the I begin. So breathe in, folks. Breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Those of us who are here in this room are breathing in each other's breathe outs, if that makes sense. All right? So, excuse me. During the summer of the ochre summer of 2019-2020, the nation's black summer, that air we breathed in and out contained the remnants of multiple previously living beings, trees and shrubs, ferns and mosses, koala and kangaroo, butterflies and snakes. What had been them became one with the air, and then it became one with us. We breathed it in, we breathed it out, as we have to do. In the process of the outward breaths, exhalations, the air was again altered, leaving behind some things. Oxygen, bits of ochre death. You know, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not even a real doctor, so I can't be specific, all right? But I do know that it left behind remnants of death because my asthma got worse. I know this too because of the effects left folks in hospitals. And babies born before their time. We beings changed by the smoke in the air, the smoke that was all that was left of the previously living. So we breathe in, and then we breathe out. So who would have thought in that summer of 2019, 2020, that my breathing out could be a death sentence for someone else? And we know that now. We're acutely aware. If there is one thing COVID has taught us, it is that my breathe-outs very quickly become your breathe-ins. And that another species rides the flow of our breath. So at a more elementary level, at what point does the air we breathe in, that external, elemental, and inanimate form, become internal and animate? Or at what point does it animate you and become animate too? Where's the boundary? Is it at the skin of your nose? Is it in your nasal passage? When it enters your lungs? When the oxygen is extracted? When it's no longer you? When on the journey does it lose its identity as part of you and become part of me? Are you and I now one because we share air? What was me, the air that sustained me for seconds until I took another breath, now flows between you and me, and my earlier breaths are now probably part of you. So Māori have a ritualised tradition, the hongi, that recognises the sharing of air as a sharing of the spiritual essence, of a sharing of the power for life and for good. A pepeha often starts right there with the statement, Tihe Moriora. So while that's a claim for the right to speak, the expression also alludes to the sneeze of life, to the blend of physical, elemental, and spiritual. And that's my point here tonight. There are ways of being in the world and epistemological frameworks that celebrate relationships, relationality, and commitment to the whole, not just to the fragments and to the fragmentation of being. And so it's not just other people that are drawn into these fields of relationships. It's the planet as a whole. So we could stop and think about which academic discipline the breath belongs to. And I could give you a whole string, and I've got a whole string listed here, but I've just decided I don't feel like reciting it, of all the different disciplines that we could say the breath belongs to. And I don't really know which one it belongs to. I think it probably belongs to a whole bunch of them. But in disciplining our thinking, we're forgetting the power of relating and of relationships. What I know is that the two events of 2019-2020, the bushfires and the scourge of COVID, and also the cascading, boy, there's another word I can't manage, cascading tragedies of the floods in New South Wales and in Queensland and actually across the globe. Fire and floods across the globe. These tragedies are teaching all humans that we must think relationally, that it is absolutely clear that despite all efforts to describe or build or enforce or draw boundaries, they are an illusion. Nothing is isolated and nothing exists without the whole. So multi-species justice breaks these barriers. And more than that, multi-species justice challenges some of the really basic assumptions of justice theories, suggesting that the need to move beyond the universalising impulse of Western philosophy. And I'm suggesting here that to be just, theories of multi-species justice must avoid a trap set by Europe's Enlightenment forebears, that impulse to universalise. So the Western philosophic tradition isn't the only philosophic tradition. Indigenous peoples, like all people all over the world, have thought and continue to think and to theorise about what it is to be in the world, about knowledge and knowledge structures, about politics and justice and relating. That's philosophy. It's not just Indigenous wisdom, although for goodness sake, we could do with more wisdom in the world. These are bodies of thought that result from observation, experimentation, thinking, discussing, recording in story, recording in song, recording in dance, recording in art, and ongoing inquiry. Just because it's encased in books, Western philosophy is not necessarily the most advanced tradition. And I rest that argument on the evidence of the globalised environmental degradation, climate change, pollution, slavery, racial injustice, gender injustice. I don't need to list the wrongs that are embedded into justice theory and into political theory more generally. It is a philosophy that rents the connection between human and nature, that grants unbridled domination to some humans, and that has brought the earth to its current parlous state. So don't get me wrong, there's a whole lot of good in European philosophy. There is much to be gained and much to be celebrated, but not the ways it's been employed to dominate, demonise, destroy and degrade. So multi-species justice seeks to break that pattern. It seeks justice far beyond the border of the human form. It brings the non-human or the natural realm into the spheres of justice so that it can be pluriversal. So I'll move now for the last part of the discussion more directly to how Maori philosophy and to Maori philosophy and what it has to offer multi-species justice. So the formulation of multi-species justice as political theory, as a subfield of research and of theory, presents an opportunity to self-consciously open the field to multiple philosophic approaches. And I'm suggesting that as multi-species justice evolves as an academic theory, it can avoid creating boundaries around knowledge systems and around understanding of what counts and what does not. I take very seriously Maori philosophy as a source of principles for living in simpatico with the non-human realm. So Maori philosophy doesn't actually cast non-human or the animal human outside history or outside of morality or outside of justice. In fact, quite the opposite. Maori philosophy seeks to understand the connections between matter and spirit. The material and the spiritual are thought to be inseparable. And moreover, there's no hard boundary between the animate and the inanimate for Maori. So Maori philosophy tells us human beings are not the peak creation, that which may legitimately dominate all other creation, but rather that we human beings are tiana, we are the younger sibling of the cosmic and earthly order. That doesn't separate mind and body, moral human and animal other, living and non-living. What's important, and I come back to this, what is important is how things relate. So in that philosophic framework, in a Māori philosophic framework, for instance, it would be impossible for the Minister of Environment to imagine challenging in the High Court the idea that they or their office might have responsibilities to future generations, as our Australian Minister is doing currently. That is just simply wouldn't enter into the realms of possibility if she were working out of a Māori philosophical base. So a constant reminders of this order of relationships is found in each person's pepeha. Pepeha that I recited at the beginning is my pepeha. It has features in common with the hapu, with the sub-tribe, and with iwi, the tribe to which I'm affiliated. So the pepeha is a recitation of genealogy and relationships. While the traditional structure might vary from iwi to iwi or hapu to hapu, the format follows a similar tradition or similar pattern. It starts with a reference to the ancestors, human, mountain, and river. It may be a lake, it may be the sea. It reminds us of our human ancestry and our Pacific connection, our Pacific history. So the very first set of relationships are established at the introduction of the pepeha. They're given primacy, as it were. And then a Māori person's genealogy is grounded in that way in deep time, in the land, taking one's imagination back to the potential within all creation with each recitation as we identify our ancestral mountain and our ancestral rivers and waters. Each recitation includes one's ancestral, physical, spiritual, and emotional entanglements with and dependencies on lands and waters. The time of creation is always present and acknowledged. So the pepeha reminds us of our relationships to the physical environment because it understands that we are the river, say, and the river is us. And there are sayings, there are metaphors that embody that concept. Without the mountain, without the river or the seas or the lakes, we just don't exist. So furthermore, the mountain and the river may be thought of by us as ancestors. That is, no hard distinction is made between the living and the other, the human and the non-human. Everything with form, human or non-human, living or not, has a spiritual force called Māori, and a sort of an interactive life force, a potential generated from and by creation. So Māori exists in all matter. Māori connects and establishes relations. The pepeha sets up our identity founded on reverence and respect for and responsibility to the environment, rather than a foundation of individual rights and freedoms that focus on the cultural. Our pepeha identifies the cultural, the iwi and the hapu and the marae, or the meeting place where formal discussions take place of an orator, locating us then also within our relationships to family and to political units. This is at the level at which responsibility for and to the environment is maintained. Ono or mana comes from the relationship with the land and waters. And it is at this level responsibilities for kaitiakitanga, the protocols on protection and guardianship of land, waters, plants, creatures and spirits reside. So in our pepeha, we might now speak of our immediate family, our partner, our children, and before finally, in the penultimate line, finally, last of all, giving our own name. So we are the outcome, the end product of the creation, of migrations, of land, waters, ancestors, and relationships. So the philosophical foundation, this lived expression of multi-species justice, is the antithesis of and provides an antidote to the silent categories of individualism, anthropocentrism, androcentrism, and rationality that underscore the epistemological foundations of the human-non-human divide. That philosophical brew that now threatens all life on Earth. The risk is to imagine that the Enlightenment philosophical foundations are the only ones available, and that all we need to do is apply them in some sort of slightly adjusted format, new laws, new regulations, revised agreements, to turn promise, or poison rather, to promise. So in conclusion, multi-species justice promises to break down boundaries between disciplines, traditions, philosophies, and life on Earth. It promises to reinstate human beings and the artifices of our life to a position of relationship with, rather than domination over other members of our species, of other species, of animal and plant, fungus and moss, of soil, rock, water and air. Multi-species justice draws us out from our disciplinary boundaries to share knowledge, methods, and the magic of collaboration. It encourages us into relationships and to celebrate responsibilities across multiple boundaries. So breathe in, folks. With every breath, your being is changed. With every breath, you mingle with animal, vegetable, viral, elemental, and chemical other. You are not alone. You are multi-species. Knowing that is the gift of multi-species justice.
So we have about 15 minutes to have a conversation with Christine. I am bursting with responses and questions, but I have privileged access, so I would like to invite questions from people in the room or people not in the room, or comments, reflections, thoughts. Sheila.
That was really nice, Christine. Thank you. I'm just going to ask a question that is sort of basic, but I think is in a more academic way put forward a lot, but I'll just say it in a layperson's way. I agree with everything you said about us all being connected, and that it's important to look at it, to look at things in their connections. But I've often heard people say, well, if you do that, then where are you supposed to start? How are you supposed to identify problems or solutions? How can you even think about things without the disciplines and the divisions? It's so much a way of our thinking, and I mean, I'm all for changing our way of thinking completely, but within what's here, within the academy and our society, how do you start?
I think SEI is a good start. Within the academy, I think it's these sorts of without being greasy, within these sorts of institutions that you start getting the breakdown. I'm not suggesting by any means that there should be no depth to scholarship. There should be no disciplinary depth, as it were. What I think is important is that we start moving sideways breadth as well. So not only thinking very deeply within disciplines, but then connecting that thinking with other areas. And it's these sorts of institutes that are doing it. I'm going to take these bangles off again because the mic will be picking up the rattle. And that takes hard work, and that takes humility. that takes an ability to step out of what is comfortable into a realm that perhaps is not so comfortable. And I think it is absolutely imperative, because I don't think we can even begin to start tackling, the global problems. One discipline can't solve climate change. It can't solve the refugee problem. We really need to be thinking together to do that. So yeah, I think SEI is a perfect example of how it can be done.
I might just alternate and take one from outside the room and one from inside the room, but I'm going to combine two from outside the room. So there was a question before from Ross Letts asking, how does multi-species justice influence politics? But Jamie Loveday has asked, how can you see Maori philosophy played out in the day-to-day of business? So perhaps questions around operationalisation in different institutional spheres, including in politics.
Thank you both for those questions. I'll tackle politics first, and I think the personhood laws in New Zealand for the Whanganui River, for Te Uruwera and for Taranaki Maunga are a perfect example of blending Māori philosophy with the political and legal structures of Aotearoa. So giving physical entities a personhood status, a legal identity, as the legislation says, with all the rights and duties of a legal person. So that's an example of it playing out in politics. I think also in politics it can play out in, I would hope to think that increasingly it will play out in tempering some of the harsher edges, shall I say, of domestic politics in Aotearoa. The more Māori influence there, the more there could be a recognition of shared responsibilities both to the environment and to each other. In business, that's a really interesting one. There are an increasing number of Māori businesses that use kaupapa Māori frameworks for their business operations. So they are running their capitalistic businesses, their commercial businesses, on Māori principles, which means that the idea of relationality is embedded into, and relational responsibilities to each other in a company are embedded in that. And although I don't know a lot about a lot of them, also responsibility to the environment. The third thing I can add to that is that iwi have, so the tribal groups have sort of business responsibilities of their own. Māori iwi have received settlement, Treaty of Waitangi settlement monies, and many of them have set up iwi businesses. Some of those businesses have 100-year and 200-year plans. There is one iwi I know of that has a 1,000-year plan. So they are thinking about the impact of what they're doing out 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years. Now, if you're making a decision today, how different that is if you're thinking 100, 200, 1,000 years out versus the next quarterly report. It can have, I think, a significant difference on how businesses operate.
Thank you. There's a question here, thank you.
I'm coming more from the point of view of a lay person, I guess, on this. Well, not in your area anyway. Now, how does the idea of a hierarchy amongst species fit in to the Maori philosophy? Because we certainly have one, don't we? I mean, we'll eat certain animals and not others, and we'll kill pests, cane toads, cockroaches, rats, whatever. Is there some sort of Buddhist philosophy that comes with this as well, that, that we're all species are equal and we don't kill any of them? And if so, how would that fit into politics and be managed?
Can I just use my chair's prerogative? Because Philip McKibben, who is one of our brilliant multi-species justice PhD students, has asked a complementary question. So if you don't mind, I'll just put them together. So he said, kia ora, thank you for this talk, Christine, here in Aotearoa. We hear a lot about being a good ancestor, and often this is framed predominantly in terms of responsibilities to human descendants. One thing I'm concerned about, for example, are the ways this is used to mobilise Maori and New Zealanders generally against introduced species who are themselves victims of colonisation and are targeted simply for existing. Do you think there's potential for this intergenerational discourse and Maori Indigenous philosophy generally to be hijacked for human supremacist ends? So similarly, there's questions about, yeah.
And in short, Purpi, yes, I think so. So that's a really simple answer to the question from Aotearoa. More generally, Caroline, yes, look, the sorts of Linnaean categorizations that we're familiar with in the West, the sort of categorizations of hierarchies of species, is not the way that Maori knowledge of the natural realm is structured. It's structured along what relates to what else. So it's the question, again, it comes back to relationships rather than to hierarchies, all right? Going back more to this point of, well, what can you kill and what can't you kill? And I don't have a clear answer to that. Traditionally one eats what is available, and what is available in Aotearoa are fish, birds, reptiles, grubs. Rats came from Polynesia, pigs came from Polynesia, and then later all the other animals came. So there's no prohibition, no automatic prohibition on eating and killing creatures. There is a tradition, though, of restricting over-exploitation of creatures. It's called a rahui. So if a leader thinks that an area is being over-exploited, they will close it for a year, 2 years, maybe just a season, maybe longer, that fishing ground or whatever. So there's that sort of tradition of protection. In terms of introduced species, I'll go back to Purpi and the introduced species question. Can it be harnessed? And it is, and it has been harnessed for that purpose, for the purpose of getting rid of pest creatures. Now, the really hard question, the really thorny question, the really difficult question around introduced species, for me, from a Maori perspective, is where does our responsibility lie? Does our responsibility lie to the native species that are being destroyed? So the fact is, Australia's protected opossum is a real pest in New Zealand. It eats forests. It's killing forests. It eats birds' eggs. It eats little birds. They have destroyed enormous areas of wildlife. But those creatures are those creatures are also creatures. Those creatures are also animals. Those creatures are also have, for lack of another word, rights of their own. As Piripi said, they have been brought in there. It was not their choice to be taken to New Zealand. They're just getting on with life as best as they can. And for me, it's just an incredibly fraught issue, and I haven't thought it through. I haven't yet managed to resolve in my own mind my responsibilities to native flora and fauna and my commitment to the flourishing of all life. It just screws me up, to be honest.
You know, there's a wonderful phrase of Elizabeth Povinelli's, which I think is really appropriate to this, where she says, the fact that we're recognising the type of permeability of boundaries that you're talking about doesn't mean it's all smooth. A very academic phrase. And I think that's such a great example of it. Multi-species justice doesn't, I think you're suggesting really importantly, it doesn't mean that there aren't tough problems to work through. But I think the way that you just brought that lens of taking seriously all of the beings who are there, and then what do you do? That's a beautiful exemplification. I'm going to apologise to the other people who have asked questions, but we do need to end in a moment. And I know if I pass them on, then Christine will give deep and rich answers that will take us past the time. So I want to thank everybody who came virtually and in the room. Particularly, I want to thank Genevieve Wright and Eloise Vetterplace for making this possible, and of course Christine. And in my introduction to you, Christine, I talked about the how, not just the what, and I just want to pause on how you presented. The first part of your presentation, after your own pepaha, was a pepaha for our community. You placed your own thinking within the conditions of possibility of nurturing conversations, websites, blogs, booking rooms, all of the multi-dimensional relations that make it possible for you to do what you do. And again, this is one of your singular contributions, that you don't just talk about, you are, as Gandhi said, the way that you seek. And that is a gift for us, and you have forged a way that even when you leave us, we will continue to walk that path. And hopefully, even though you will be across the gap, is that what it's called?
No, the ditch.
The ditch. Across the ditch, hopefully it's one that we can traverse with the type of fluidity and boundarylessness that you have articulated. So thank you. Thank you. I just want to finish by saying that SEI is a wealth of events. I'm not going to tell people what events we have coming up, but you can find them on the Sydney Environment Institute website. At the bottom of that website, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and then you will never miss out on knowing what's coming up. You can follow us on Twitter at SEI_Sydney, or on Facebook at Sydney Environment Institute. And good night, and I wish everybody and your worlds well.
Thank you. Thank you.